that here I am in a university with lots of scientists that they would say, oh, Jim, you don't understand this? Here, let's go to lunch and I'll explain it to you, because a child can understand this. You'd think that they do that. Nobody's come close to doing that on Origin of Life. Nobody has come close. And as soon as I get them isolated and alone, they'll admit to me, we're clueless on this thing. We have no idea. And there's been whole institutes set up for the discovery of the origin of life. And they're nowhere close, and they get further away every year. And it's a big facade.
And you go all the way down to the super galaxy cluster, the cluster, the features of our galaxy, the local bubble that we're in, all the way down to the interior of the Earth. No matter where you look, you see overwhelming evidence for fine-tuned design. And I think that's what scares people, Eric. Fine-tuning doesn't just establish that there's a God out there. It tells you it's a personal God, a caring God. And I think that has implications for how we live our life.
Hey, folks, I'm talking to Dr. James Tour. I write about him extensively in my new book, Is Atheism Dead? He is a nanoscientist at Rice University in Houston. He and I got to know each other, and he started talking to me about the idea of life supposedly emerging from non-life. And the more I got to know about the subject and the more I got to know Dr. Tour, the more I thought it is wild that no one ever talks about this. This is a major apologetic for the existence of God or something like that. I also met a man in Albuquerque, Dr. Stephen Collins, who told me about the discovery of biblical Sodom. That was equally astonishing in the archaeological sphere, and I thought, why doesn't anyone know about this? So those two gentlemen, now friends, are at the center of what I talk about in my book, and I thought it would be fun, actually, to get Dr. Tour on the program, and you know what happened, don't you? We got him. Dr. Tour, welcome.
Thank you, Eric.
I'm going to call you Jim just because you said I could, but I want to say that it really was you who made me see clearly the stunning idea that for 70 years, since this experiment in 1952, we've made no progress in determining how it is that stuff that is not life, zero life, suddenly turns into life. And I find it kind of funny. For people who don't know what a nanoscientist is and what you do, can you tell my audience what it is that a nanoscientist purports to do?
Well, I'm an organic chemist by training, but I work in the area of nanotechnology, where we're studying very small entities, from materials to electronics to medicine, and packaging things in small packages and trying to have them deliver into parts of the body or being used to strengthen materials or making denser memories for computers.
What? Okay. So what is it about what you do and your training and your experience that gives you the ability to say with tremendous confidence that people who say, oh yeah, we're on the verge of, connecting the dots on this whole non-life to life thing, what is it that makes you so confident that they are in fact blowing smoke?
Well, organic chemists are much less prone to say that. People who actually make molecules for a living and have really read the literature on what's known in origin of life, people are much, much slower to make such a suggestion. And the reason is because if we look at where the science has come, it really hasn't progressed very far. So in 1952, there was an experiment that you were referencing, and that is the Miller-Urey experiment, where amino acids were made from basic building blocks like hydrogen cyanide and carbon dioxide and ammonia. And once these amino acids were made, people thought, well, this must be the origin of life. It's going to be no time before we figure this thing out. And so for 70 years, we've been working toward this thing, and people have been working toward this thing. We find it's much more complex than what people thought. In fact, Miller and Urey have said the same thing, that it was much more complex than they thought. Now, one could argue that we haven't gotten much closer. I argue that we've gotten further away in the last 70 years. And you say, well, how could we be further away? And it's because the complexity of the cell Our understanding, as we get more understanding, the complexity of the cell is far greater than what we thought it was. It's not just a bunch of protoplasm. There is so much machinery, so much biological machinery in a cell that you would have to have. And so the target has moved further away with time. And so it's moving away faster than we're moving toward it.
Well, look, so you bring us to the real question. Why, for 70 years, have kids been taught in school that science has solved the problem of how life came into being without God? Why?
I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist. It's hard for me to know the why, but I can underscore that so many people are taught about this primordial soup model, where you have a few molecules sitting in a pond somewhere, some lightning strikes, and a cell assembles, and then those cells start to assemble into an organism, and a creature comes slithering out of the pond. People are taught that. And when there's denial that's saying, oh, people are not taught that, I've lined up over 20 different textbooks that show this, from the elementary school level to the advanced college level, still talking about the primordial soup model. I've had surveys done that show that people think that scientists have created simple life in the lab, including frogs. And then other questions about simple life in the lab, including single bacterium. And throughout, people are totally deceived on what has been done. So it's a real tragedy. Why this has happened, I'm not sure, but probably some people can speculate.
Well, I mean, I'm always happy to speculate, but I'm still fascinated that you know enough about this to say this very clearly. The odds against this are so astonishingly high that you do have to wonder why somebody would keep pushing. What do they have to gain? I mean, would anybody dare say, we know we're barking up the wrong tree? Are you the only one publicly to say that?
Well, I'm one of the few voices who is a practicing scientist doing mainline science. There's just a small number of us that are saying this, because to say that we have no idea where we've come from, it's hard on one's career. So they keep you from getting certain funding, they keep you from getting certain things, and many people like to say certain things about us. So others don't take it on. But I will tell you that behind closed doors, many of my colleagues have agreed with me. Many of them have said, I agree with you. We have no idea how this thing has been done. And they keep trying to lessen the problem. They say, oh, well, cells were much simpler back then. That's wrong. This has already been calculated. Biophysicists have already calculated you'll need minimally 206 protein coding genes. And you need a whole array of substructure to build the simplest of cells that could possibly be built. So they keep trying to change the problem, but it doesn't go away. It's right there.
Do you think that people, it seems clear to me that the reason your career can get dented or severely harmed from talking about this is because you're challenging a materialist scientific paradigm, that if you challenge that paradigm, and by talking about this, you do challenge it, it seems to frighten people.
It absolutely does frighten people. And it seems, Eric, as if I'm speaking to people who are not talking about science anymore. They're talking about a religion. Because when you push somebody's religion and then they don't have answers, they start getting extremely defensive. And this is what happens. As soon as I start poking at this thing, people start getting extremely defensive. They want to quiet me. They want to ruin a career. They want to silence this sort of thing. And science is not generally that way. You would think that here I am in a university with lots of scientists, that they would say, oh, Jim, you don't understand this? Here, let's go to lunch and I'll explain it to you, because a child can understand this. You'd think that they do that. Nobody's come close to doing that on Origin of Life. Nobody has come close. And as soon as I get them isolated and alone, they'll admit to me, we're clueless on this thing. We have no idea. And there's been whole institutes set up for the discovery of the origin of life. And they're nowhere close, and they get further away every year. And it's a big facade. There's a bunch of nonsense going on out there.
Well, I remember reading an article. I thought it was in the Atlantic Monthly in 1989 or 1990, a cover article looking back on 40 years since Miller-Urey and saying effectively, we know absolutely nothing to this day. That was in 1990. We are now 31 years past that, and you're saying we know less than nothing. This is dramatic. I think there needs to be some kind of a reckoning. I think you're doing that. By writing about you and this in my book, I'm hoping to push some people to deal with this, because this is something that, I mean, one of the things I say in the book is that this is the thing that no one talks about. Everybody will talk about, let's argue about evolution or theistic evolution or intelligent design or Darwinian evolution. We argue about how you get from single cells to people. No one ever touches on what you're touching on, is how we get from non-life to life. And I suspect the deafening silence is because people are scared to death. They know that there's no winner. If they open their mouths, it's just going to be bad. It was probably about 1990 that I discovered the books of Hugh Ross, and they launched me on a journey that I'm still on. Some of you know I've just come out with a book called Is Atheism Dead?, the first third of which deals with the very subject of science and the Bible and God and all that great stuff. So it's a thrill for me to have Hugh Ross on the program. Welcome to the Eric Metaxas Show, Hugh Ross. Great to see you.
Well, good to see you too. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned in the beginning of the book that it really was you who got me thinking about things, for example, like the fine-tuned universe. I had literally never heard about that until about 1990 when I read your book. Maybe it was Fingerprint of God. I can't remember which book it was, but I was astonished to read this, having never heard about it. And over the decades, I have been quietly amassing more and more evidence as it piles up, as science draws us closer and closer to the idea that it's obvious an intelligence created the universe. There's no way this just happened. When did you, in your career, first notice these things or become acquainted with the fine-tuned argument?
It probably goes back to my teenage years. I mean, I started getting serious about astronomy when I was 7 years of age. And
wait a minute. That's no teenager. Yeah. That's a very early. You're probably the world's youngest teenager. You're smart. You probably achieved teenagedom at age 7. Okay, so at age 7, what happened in your life to get you thinking about this stuff?
Well, I was looking up at the stars and wanted to know why they were hot. And my parents said, go to the library. And that started me on reading 4 or 5 books on astronomy and physics per week. And during my teenage years, I actually launched a research study in astronomy with my telescope, looking at newborn stars and different gaseous nebulae. Wound up winning the British Columbia Science Fair, went on to the Canadian Science Fair. And then I decided, hey, I'm going to continue that. I've been fascinated with astronomy ever since, but I got struck by the fine-tuning. Probably beginning at about age 15 is when I realized.
Wow. What kind of a telescope did you have as a teenager to be able to see some of the things that you saw?
That was only a 4.5-inch telescope. So I was kind of constrained to the brighter objects. And because I was in Vancouver, I had to stay up late every night to catch the few moments when the clouds would part.
So at 17 or 15, you said you started thinking about the fine-tuned universe. I write about it at length in this book because obviously the evidence for it only increases. That's to me the great irony in the thesis of my book, that the more science we know, the more it points to God, the opposite of the God of the gaps theory, which we've been laboring under as a culture for a long time. So what were the first things at age 15 that you noticed along such lines?
The structure of our solar system, everything that had to be designed in the different planets, our moon, the sun, in order to make advanced life possible here on Earth. Just looking at our galaxy and realizing all the fine-tuning that needs to take place there. And you talk about this evidence expanding. I think it's exponential. I mean, we see an exponential growth in the fine-tuning evidence. You know, I think it's a thrill, Eric, to be alive in the 21st century. No other century of humanity has seen such an explosion of new evidences from the book of nature for the existence of God. And fine-tuning, I think, is a remarkable example of that. I mean, we've been documenting this for 4 decades now. how the evidence for fine-tuning gets approximately 1,000 times stronger every month.
That's no joke. I mean, I've realized that myself just following your career and your books and what I read. It just gets more and more crazy. When you said that at age 15 or so, you noticed that the solar system, which you could see with your 4.5-inch telescope, bespoke fine tuning or creation, being created, intelligently created. What are the kinds of things that you noticed with your young mind that led you to think about that? What was it about the solar system, for example, that made you think this?
The sun has to be almost exactly middle age. That's when you get the necessary stability and the minimal flaring activity that makes advanced life possible. It has to be a particular mass. Stars more massive and less massive are more active. So that has to be fine-tuned. You need the planets to be distributed in a particular way in order that Earth get the just right delivery of comets and asteroids, not too much, not too little. The moon has to be the appropriate distance and mass so that it stabilizes the tilt of our rotation axis. As I've gotten older, I realize what we call this fine-tuning argument has predictive power. The first thing we discovered about the moon is that it's the fact that it's so very massive compared to our planet stabilizes the tilt of our rotation axis. But if this is evidence for purposeful design rather than accidental design, if we study the moon in more detail, we should discover more fine-tuning evidence. And indeed, that's been the track record of the past 50 years, is that the more we study the moon, the more features we find must be fine-tuned to make our existence possible.
Give us another example. We can understand how the mass of the moon would stabilize the Earth's axis and prevent wild temperature swings and that sort of thing. But what other aspects of the moon have we discovered that bear on life on Earth?
Well, there was an astronomer in Britain who noticed that, hey, the moon does stabilize the tilt of our rotation axis, but we're at the very top end of where that stability would exist. He says, why are we so close to the top end of the mass? If the moon were even 2% more massive, we'd be unstable. And so he says, there must be something special about the high mass of the moon. And he published a paper making the point that the Earth began with a rotation rate of about 2.5 hours. And in order for we to exist on this planet and have global civilization, the rotation rate has to slow down to 24 hours. And it's thanks to the great mass of the moon and its proximity that it indeed stabilizes the Earth's rotation rate, slowed down to 24 hours at exactly the time when the sun had the optimal stability for advanced life.
The moon's gravity upon the Earth acted like a drag on it, and that it slowed it down to where we are now. So that's true?
That's true, and it's still slowing it down. If we were to wait a few more million years, it'd be 25 hours a day.
Hugh, we haven't talked about anything on the nano level, but James Tour, the Rice University organic chemist, has helped me to understand that the crazy idea that life emerged from non-life 4 billion years ago, which, was bruited about as this great theory circa 1953, that has been so dramatically discredited. But very few scientists are willing to raise their hand and say, excuse me, we have no idea how life came into being. So even when you talk about the possibility of life coming into being on another planet, you would have to agree that for something as extremely complex as a single cell to come into being, you need more than random processes.
Well, what's encouraging, Eric, is that when you attend Origin of Life research conferences, and we had reasons to believe do that, and we attend them, you see remarkable honesty. The researchers there, although they often identify themselves as atheists, say when it comes to the origin of life, we're realizing we're running into intractable problems. And as we go to each Origin of Life conference, we notice that successively the problems become more intractable, not less intractable from a naturalistic perspective. But what's encouraging me is I engage these origin of life research scientists. I discovered that they're default atheists. They're not real atheists. They're so engrossed in their scientific research, they really haven't given any time to think about, hey, I might die. Is there life after death? Is there more to the universe? Does the universe have purpose? Is there purpose for life? And we find that they're very interested in engaging us to discuss these issues. They've been distracted by just how fascinating their scientific research is. In fact, one of them told me, my research is like a video game. It just consumes me, and I don't take time to think about the important issues of life. And so I think we need to realize as believers, these people are not totally closed. Some are, but some just are really eager to engage people who know as much about the science as they do to discuss the issues of life that are beyond just their research.
Anybody who's particularly thoughtful about these things can't be an atheist. They can be an agnostic, but really to say there is no God, I'm pretty sure there's no God, it gets sillier and sillier almost by the day. All you have to do is look at the information. But a lot of people are, I think, frightened to look at the information because they don't want to have to deal with it. It's like the people who didn't want to look through Galileo's telescope. They said, I'd rather not know. I don't want to be persuaded by that nasty evidence. I'd rather just live in my little Aristotelian world. Tell us again the title of your book that's coming out next year. I'm really looking forward to it.
Well, it's my 5th book on fine-tuning, and it's called Design to the Core. And people can get free chapters of any of my books at reasons.org/Ross. So if they want to get a flavor of what's happening with the fine-tuning evidence over the past decades, that'd be a good way to go. But Design to the Core is basically making the point. Whether you look at the universe on the very largest size scales, say like the cosmic web, and you go all the way down to the super galaxy cluster, the features of our galaxy, the local bubble that we're in, all the way down to the interior of the Earth, no matter where you look, you see overwhelming evidence for fine-tuned design. And I think that's what scares people, Eric. Fine-tuning doesn't just establish that there's a God out there, it tells you it's a personal God, a caring God. And I think that has implications for how we live our life.